A soldier came home with his battle-trained K9, paying only $1 for a deserted farm. But the instant he stepped inside, his breath caught. In the flickering light from a broken window, a little girl stood barefoot on the dusty floor, clutching a torn teddy bear. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Daddy, is it really you?" He had never been told he had a child. His wife was gone, no letter, no trace. Yet, this child stood here alone, holding a birth certificate with his name on it. And in that moment, he realized someone had gone to great lengths to hide her from him. The question wasn't just why, it was what danger still lingered in these walls. The winter sky was a pale silver, the air sharp enough to sting with every breath. Michael Harris climbed out of his old blue pickup truck, boots crunching on the frozen gravel of the long abandoned driveway. At 47, his body still carried the solid build of a man who had spent a lifetime working with his hands, though the set of his shoulders had grown heavier over the years. His short-cropped brown hair was threaded with silver, and a trimmed beard framed a jaw that had once been clean-shaven every day in the Marines. His blue-gray eyes, tired yet steady, scanned the weathered house in front of him, the kind of gaze shaped by both the battlefield and years of back-breaking dock work. Beside him, Buddy, his 6-year-old German shepherd, trotted forward, black and brown coat thick against the cold. Buddy's strong frame moved with a quiet alertness, every step measured. The dog's amber eyes swept over the frosted yard, ears twitching, nose testing the air, as if searching for something hidden. He was a veteran too, once trained for military service, before retiring to follow Michael home. The house before them leaned slightly to the left, as though time itself had been pushing against it for decades. Its white paint had faded to a dull gray, and the porch sagged beneath a blanket of frost. Moss clung stubbornly to the roof shingles, while the windows stared blankly back at him, rimmed with grime. It had cost him $1. One. The real estate agent in Cedar Creek, a thin, sandy-haired man with restless eyes, had pushed the contract across the desk with hardly a word, muttering something about the owner just wanting it gone. Michael hadn't pressed for details. He'd never been one to dig into other people's reasons, and after years of sleeping in cramped barracks, drafty rentals, and sometimes the cab of his truck, any roof over his head felt like a victory. He climbed the porch steps, the wood groaning under his weight. Buddy paused, sniffing a patch of air near the door, tail low, ears high. The doorknob felt cold and stiff in Michael's grip as he turned it, pushing the door inward. The smell hit him first, not rot, but dust. The kind that settled over years without anyone stirring it, clinging to every surface. He stepped inside, boots leaving prints on the gray film covering the wooden floor. The living room was dim, what little light there was filtering through a torn lace curtain in the front window. A sagging sofa sat against one wall, the fabric worn to threads, and an old armchair leaned at an odd angle near the cold fireplace. Michael took a slow step forward, scanning the space. He could almost hear the emptiness. No hum of appliances, no ticking of a clock, just the faint creak of the floorboards under his weight. His mind was already turning toward practical matters, sweeping out the dust, checking for leaks, getting the old wood stove running. Then Buddy stopped. The dog's body went still, head lifting slightly, nose pointed toward the shadowed corner by the staircase. Michael followed his gaze. That was when he saw her. She was small, no more than 9 years old, with tangled blonde hair falling in limp waves around a pale face smudged with dirt. She wore a faded blue dress with a fraying hem, bare legs marked with faint scratches, and feet pink from the cold. In her thin arms she clutched a teddy bear so worn the fabric was bald in patches, its stitched eyes dull with age. She stood perfectly still, watching him with eyes the color of autumn leaves, wide and guarded. For a moment, Michael thought she might run. Instead, she swallowed, tightened her hold on the bear, and took a tentative step forward. Her lips parted, and her voice came out small, trembling, almost a whisper. "Daddy!" Michael froze, every muscle tightening. The words seemed to hang in the cold air between them, heavier than any he had heard in years. He had never known he had a child. Michael didn't move right away. The girl's whisper still hung in the cold air, and he felt as if the world had slowed to a crawl. Buddy, sensing his hesitation, took 2 measured steps forward, tail low but relaxed, as though offering himself as a bridge between two wary strangers. Michael crouched slowly, careful not to loom over her. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his voice low. The girl's arms tightened around the teddy bear. "Emily," she said after a pause. Her voice was quiet, almost practiced in being overlooked. Michael studied her more closely. She was small for her age, all narrow shoulders and thin wrists, the hollows under her eyes faintly shadowed. Her blonde hair had dulled from neglect, and a faint scrape marked one knee. She looked like a child who had learned to be invisible. "Emily, where's your mom?" he asked. For a moment, he thought she might not answer, but then her gaze dropped to the floorboards. "She's gone," she murmured, as if the word itself could shatter if spoken too loud. "Miss Victoria said I have to stay here and not bother anyone." The name meant nothing to Michael yet, but the way Emily's voice changed, shrinking, almost folding in on itself, made his jaw tighten. "Miss Victoria?" he prompted gently. Emily nodded once. "She comes sometimes, brings bread, says I'm not allowed outside." Buddy's ears twitched at a faint draft rattling the window panes. Michael glanced around. The room was dim, the furniture coated in a layer of dust that told him it hadn't been lived in properly for years. There was no hum of electricity, no sign of a working heater. The air inside was nearly as cold as the air outside. "Is there heat?" Michael asked, already knowing the answer. Emily shook her head. "No lights either," she added, almost apologetically. Michael's mind flashed back to his deployments. Cold nights in unheated outposts, huddled in whatever shelter they could find. This was no place for a child, especially alone. "Do you have anything else to eat?" he asked. Emily hesitated, then pointed toward the kitchen. He found it in seconds. A cracked counter, an empty sink, and on a small wooden table, a single half loaf of stale bread wrapped in a faded kitchen towel. Beside it sat a small pile of books, worn from use, their pages yellowed. Titles varied from children's stories to an old beginner's reading guide. "I learned to read from Mama's books," Emily said from the doorway, her voice carrying a mix of pride and sadness. Michael set the bread back down and exhaled through his nose. "All right," he said quietly, mostly to himself. "We're not doing this tonight." He returned to the living room and shrugged off his heavy coat, wrapping it around Emily. She sank into it as though the warmth surprised her. Buddy eased closer and rested his head gently against her knee. "You're staying here?" Emily asked, her tone wary but hopeful. "Just for tonight," Michael replied, though his mind was already rejecting the idea of leaving her here alone again. "We'll make a fire in the stove." The stove was ancient, its iron body speckled with rust, but it would do. Michael found a bundle of split logs stacked in a dusty corner, along with a few sheets of old newspaper. Soon, a reluctant flame caught, and the room began to soften with a faint, welcome heat. Emily sat cross-legged on the couch, the teddy bear still pressed to her chest, watching the fire with wide eyes as if it were a rare sight. Michael lowered himself into the armchair opposite her. "How long have you been here alone?" he asked. She shrugged, her gaze dropping again. "I don't know. A while. Miss Victoria comes every few days." Something about that answer made Michael's stomach knot. He thought about the years he'd been gone, first overseas, then drifting between jobs when he came back, trying to keep moving so he didn't have to think too hard about what he'd lost. Had someone known where to find him? Had they chosen not to? As the fire warmed the room, Buddy lay down near the hearth, head resting on his paws, though his eyes remained on Emily. Outside, the frost deepened, pressing against the windows like a silent witness. Later, when the light outside faded to a dim blue, Michael found a blanket in the upstairs closet. It smelled faintly of cedar and age, but it was clean. He laid it over Emily, who had curled up on the couch. "You should get some sleep," he said softly. She nodded, though her eyes stayed on him for a long moment before closing. Michael sat back in the armchair, staring into the fire. In Emily's brief words and careful movements, he saw more than a neglected child. He saw someone who had been kept in the shadows, deliberately, and taught to believe her presence was a burden. He clenched his fists lightly, feeling that old, restless heat stir in his chest. He had been kept from her. He didn't know how or why, but he could feel it in his bones. Buddy stirred at his feet, and Michael reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "We'll figure this out, boy," he murmured. The house was quiet except for the faint crackle of the fire and the steady breathing of the little girl wrapped in his coat. For the first time in years, Michael felt the pull of responsibility. Not the kind forged in the ranks or on the docks, but something far more personal. And as the night pressed in around them, he realized that whatever his next steps were, they would start here, in this cold, forgotten house, with this fragile girl who had called him Dad. The morning light filtered weakly through the torn lace curtain, and Michael stirred from the armchair, his neck stiff. The fire had long since burned down to glowing embers. Emily was still curled on the couch, wrapped in his coat, her breathing soft and even. Buddy was awake, lying near the hearth with his head on his paws, amber eyes watching the room in that alert but resting way only trained dogs seem to master. Michael moved quietly so as not to wake the girl, slipping outside into the brittle cold. The air bit at his cheeks as he stepped onto the porch. Frost clung to the grass, and the faint sound of a rooster crowing came from somewhere down the road. From where he stood, he could see a small house just past the line of bare maple trees. Smoke rose from its chimney, and the scent of wood smoke carried faintly on the wind. Michael decided to pay a visit. If anyone knew what had happened to Samantha and why Emily had been left alone here, it might be a neighbor. Buddy padded beside him, paws crunching on the icy dirt path. The house belonged to Karen Miller, though Michael didn't yet know her name. When she answered his knock, he took in her appearance immediately. A woman in her late 60s, with short silver hair that curled slightly at the ends, sharp gray eyes that didn't miss much, and the kind of posture that came from decades of standing her ground. Her face bore lines that spoke not just of age, but of a life that had weathered its share of storms. She wore a thick burgundy cardigan over a floral blouse and dark slacks, and her voice had a low, warm timbre when she spoke. "You must be the man who bought the Harris place," she said, looking him over with a curious mixture of recognition and appraisal. "Michael Harris," he replied, extending a hand. She took it, her grip firm. "Karen Miller? I've been here longer than I can remember. Come in before you freeze to death." Inside, her home was warm, smelling faintly of cinnamon and coffee. Photographs crowded the mantelpiece. Children, grandchildren, old black and white portraits. She gestured for him to sit at a small round table in the kitchen, where a kettle whistled softly on the stove. They talked briefly about the farm, how long it had been empty, the harsh winters that had worn it down, but Karen didn't waste much time before her tone shifted. "I knew your wife, Samantha," she said, her gaze steady. The words hit Michael with a mix of nostalgia and tension. "Before she passed, she told me something I promised to remember. She said, if Michael ever comes back, tell him Emily is his and make sure she goes to him." Michael's fingers tightened around the mug she'd placed in front of him. "Then, why is she alone in that house?" Karen's expression hardened. "Because the very day Samantha passed, Victoria Blake showed up. Said she was a friend, said she'd take care of the girl. But she never moved her into her own home, just kept her at the farm, rarely visited from what I saw. Samantha didn't trust her, though she never told me why." Michael's jaw flexed. "Victoria Blake," he repeated, committing the name to memory. Karen leaned forward slightly. "You watch yourself with her. She's the kind who smiles at you while she's calculating what she can take. Tall woman, maybe in her 40s. Sharp features, dark blonde hair, always done up neat. Dresses well, even when there's no occasion. Always seemed to know more about other people's business than she should." Back at the farm, Emily was awake when Michael returned, sitting cross-legged on the couch, Buddy lying beside her like a silent guardian. "We're going to look around a little," he told her gently. She nodded, but didn't ask why. Michael began in the living room, running his hands along the edges of furniture, pulling open drawers. He found nothing but dust and old magazines, until Buddy's nails clicked on the floorboards near the far wall. The dog had his nose pressed to a spot beneath the window, tail wagging slowly. "What is it, boy?" Michael knelt, pressing his palm to the wood. One board felt loose. With some effort, he pried it up, revealing a narrow cavity. Inside was a wooden box, its surface scuffed and its brass latch tarnished with age. Michael set it on the table, glancing toward Emily. She was watching intently, her fingers tightening around her teddy bear. The latch creaked as he opened it. Inside were a few folded papers, a faded photograph of Samantha holding a baby. Emily, he realized instantly, and a small envelope with no markings. Beneath these was a worn leather-bound notebook. Michael recognized Samantha's handwriting before he even opened it. He didn't read the words yet, not with Emily sitting there, but his chest felt tight just holding it. There were answers in here, maybe the ones he'd been denied for years. And from the way Buddy stood close, ears slightly back, Michael felt the same quiet readiness he had on missions long ago. The sense that once you opened a certain door, there was no going back. For now, he closed the box, slid it toward the center of the table, and met Emily's gaze. "We'll keep this safe," he said. Her eyes lingered on the box for a moment before she nodded. The day was dimming outside, clouds rolling in heavy and low. Michael looked toward the door, his mind already working through what he'd learned from Karen and what might come next. Somewhere out there, Victoria Blake knew exactly what she had done, and exactly what she stood to lose. The clouds hung low that afternoon, their heavy gray pressing against the bare treetops. Inside the farmhouse, Michael sat at the table with the wooden box open before him. The air was still, save for the faint sound of Buddy's slow breathing as the dog lay by the door, head resting on his paws, but eyes never truly closed. Emily was in the next room, curled up with her teddy bear and one of the old storybooks. Michael reached for the first document in the box, a folded birth certificate. His name was clearly printed in the line for father, but the paper itself bore faint scars. Around the edges of the ink, there were irregular pale smudges, as if someone had tried to rub or bleach it. The seal was intact, but it had been handled too often, worn from deliberate scrutiny. Beneath it lay a journal bound in cracked leather. He turned it over in his hands, his thumb tracing the worn edge of the cover before opening to the first page in Samantha's familiar handwriting, delicate but firm, the kind of script that used to fill their letters during deployments. The entries began simply. Notes about Emily's first words, her first steps. Small milestones that painted a picture of a life Michael hadn't been allowed to witness. But as he read further, the tone shifted. Samantha wrote about feeling watched, about V showing up uninvited, about documents she was asked to sign but didn't trust. The last few entries carried a sharper edge. Pleas to herself to stay strong, repeated mentions of needing to find a way to contact Michael. The final paragraph stopped mid-sentence. Michael closed the book, jaw tight. There was more in here than memories. It was evidence. Evidence that someone, Victoria, had maneuvered her way into Emily's life and kept him out. He stood, pacing once before grabbing the envelope at the bottom of the box. It contained a single folded letter addressed to Michael Harris, the handwriting faint but unmistakably Samantha's. The paper had yellowed slightly, but the words were legible, a confession that she feared for Emily's safety if left in Victoria's care, and a request for him to fight for their daughter if he ever returned. Michael knew he couldn't navigate this on his own. He needed someone who understood both the law and the sort of games people played when they wanted to bury the truth. His mind went to James Porter, an old comrade from his service days. James had traded fatigues for tailored suits, working now as an attorney in the nearest city. He picked up his phone, the cold metal of it grounding him for a moment. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered, deep and steady. "Mike, haven't heard from you in years. What's going on?" "James, I need your help," Michael said, his tone leaving no room for small talk. He explained in clipped sentences, Samantha's death, Emily alone in the house, the box, the altered papers. James listened without interruption. When Michael finished, there was a pause before James replied, "Bring everything you have. We'll meet in my office tomorrow morning. And Mike, don't let that girl out of your sight." Michael agreed. Hanging up, he glanced toward the living room. Emily had fallen asleep, the book sliding to one side, Buddy stationed at the end of the couch like a silent sentry. The rest of the afternoon was spent gathering the items from the box into a folder. Every page, every photograph, handled with care. In the process, Michael found himself studying the faded photograph of Samantha holding Emily as an infant. Samantha's hair had been windblown, her smile tired but real, her eyes fixed on the baby with an expression of unguarded love. Emily's tiny hand was gripping Samantha's collar, unaware of the world beyond that moment. That evening the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Michael fixed a simple dinner from what little he had in the truck, canned stew heated on the stove. Emily ate quietly, thanking him in a voice that seemed unused to being heard. Buddy hovered nearby, hopeful for scraps but never pushing. After dinner, Michael sat at the table, pen in hand, jotting notes to bring to James. Dates, names, questions that still gnawed at him. At the top of the page, he wrote one line in block letters: "Prove paternity, get custody." He didn't know yet how far Victoria would go to hold on to whatever power she thought she had. But he did know one thing. He had been absent from Emily's life long enough, and no one was going to take her from him again. In the quiet that followed, with the fire casting slow shadows across the room, Michael caught Buddy watching him intently, as if the dog knew that a battle, different from any they had fought before, was about to begin. The morning was a cold slate gray, the kind of day when the sky seemed to press down on the earth. Michael had been stacking firewood behind the farmhouse when Buddy's bark cut sharply through the still air. Not the curious alert of a stranger passing, but the deep, insistent tone of a dog that recognized a threat. Michael dropped the last log onto the stack and rounded the corner to the front yard. A sleek black SUV was parked crookedly at the edge of the gravel drive, its engine still running. Standing beside it was a tall woman in a tailored camel-colored coat, dark slacks, and heeled boots that looked as though they had never touched mud before today. Her dark blonde hair was twisted into a perfect chignon at the nape of her neck, not a strand out of place despite the wind. Her features were sharp, high cheekbones, narrow nose, lips painted a muted rose, and her pale blue eyes swept over Michael with an assessing coolness before curving into a practiced smile. "Michael Harris," she said, her voice smooth, touched with an almost theatrical warmth. "After all these years." Michael didn't return the smile. "Victoria Blake, I presume." She stepped forward, her hand half raised as if to shake his, then let it drop when he didn't move. Buddy remained at his side, ears up, a low rumble in his throat. From the corner of his eye, Michael saw the front door crack open, Emily's small face peering out. The moment her gaze landed on Victoria, her body flinched. She stepped back, half hiding behind the doorframe. Buddy's growl deepened. Michael placed a steadying hand on the dog's neck, but didn't tell him to stop. "You've met Emily," Michael said evenly. Victoria's expression softened into something that might have been pity, if it weren't so perfectly staged. "Of course. Poor child. I've been doing my best for her, you know, but my work..." She sighed delicately, as though carrying a burden too grand to describe. "It keeps me busy. I can't be here all the time." "Busy enough to leave her alone in a freezing house?" Michael's tone was flat, but the edge beneath it was sharp. Victoria's eyes flickered just for a moment before she regained her composure. "Children are resilient, Michael, and frankly, I wasn't sure you were in any position to care for her. Your circumstances don't exactly inspire stability." Her gaze swept over his worn jacket, the patched knees of his work jeans, the roughness in his hands. Michael took a step closer, his frame casting a long shadow between them. "My circumstances are a hell of a lot safer than whatever you've been giving her." Victoria's lips tightened, but she didn't look away. "You've been gone for years. She doesn't know you. I do." Her voice dropped slightly, as if confiding a truth. "I was there when Samantha died. I was the only one who stepped in." Michael caught movement behind the door, Emily inching back into view. Buddy turned his head toward her, and when she saw the dog's calm amber gaze, she seemed to take a small breath, her shoulders easing just slightly. But when her eyes drifted back to Victoria, she retreated again. "You might have been there," Michael said, "but you didn't step in. You stepped over her. You left her here to fend for herself." Victoria's eyes hardened for the first time. The polite facade cracked, revealing a flash of irritation. "Careful, Michael. Custody battles aren't won by sentiment." "Good thing I've got more than sentiment," he replied, his voice low. The wind whipped between them, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from the chimney. Victoria glanced toward the farmhouse, her gaze lingering on the windows as if memorizing the view. "We'll see how long you can keep this up," she said at last, her voice returning to that cool, polite tone. She turned and slid into the driver's seat of the SUV. The tires crunched on the gravel as she reversed down the drive, her eyes in the rearview mirror until the car disappeared beyond the maple trees. Michael stood for a long moment, staring after her. Buddy shifted his weight, giving a small chuff, as if to break the spell. He went back inside to find Emily sitting on the couch, her knees drawn up to her chest. She glanced at him, then at the door, before saying quietly, "I'm scared of her." Michael crouched down so they were eye level. "You don't have to be. Not anymore." But even as he said it, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. The battle ahead would be long, and Victoria Blake was not the kind of opponent who gave up easily. The morning after Victoria's visit, the air felt heavier. A thin mist curled across the frost-bitten fields, turning the road to town into a ribbon of pale silver. Michael loaded the wooden box, the folded documents, and the worn photograph into the passenger seat of his pickup. Buddy leapt into the back, settling in with a quiet huff, his watchful eyes tracking every movement. Emily sat beside Michael, her small frame wrapped in his coat, hands clutching the teddy bear as if it were a lifeline. They drove in silence until they reached the outskirts of the city. James Porter's office was in a narrow brick building between a diner and a shoe repair shop, the kind of place where nothing flashy distracted from the work being done inside. When they walked in, the air was warm with the faint scent of old paper and leather-bound law books. James stood from behind his desk, his presence as solid as Michael remembered from their service days. At 48, James had the broad shoulders and square jaw of a man who still kept himself in fighting shape. His hair was close-cropped, streaked with iron gray, and his dark brown eyes carried both the weight of battle and the patience of a practiced listener. He wore a charcoal suit that fit with military precision, a navy tie knotted perfectly at the collar. "Mike," he said with a firm handshake that lingered a second longer than necessary, a quiet show of solidarity. He bent slightly to greet Emily, his voice softening. "And you must be Emily. You've got your dad's eyes." Emily gave the smallest nod, still clinging to her bear, but her gaze flickered toward Michael, seeking silent reassurance. They spent the next hour going through the box. James handled each document with care, his brow furrowing when he saw the pale smudges on the birth certificate. "This," he said, tapping the page, "is tampering. We'll need to get an expert to verify that." He set it aside before opening the leather journal. His eyes moved quickly over the lines, his lips pressing into a thin line. "These entries are powerful, Mike. They paint a picture of neglect and manipulation. Combined with that letter, we have a narrative the court can't ignore." Michael pulled another envelope from his jacket pocket, a DNA test he had rushed through with the help of a clinic that owed James a favor. James scanned the results, nodding. "This seals paternity beyond any doubt. Now we tie it to the neglect." Michael told him about Karen Miller, about her account of Samantha's last words. James scribbled notes on a yellow legal pad. "I'll get her sworn statement on record. She's credible. Lived here for decades. No obvious reason to lie." While James worked, Emily wandered to the far corner of the office, where Buddy lay curled, tail thumping gently when she sat beside him. She stroked his fur absently, her voice barely above a whisper, when Michael came over. "Victoria doesn't like Buddy. She says dogs bring dirt inside." Michael crouched beside her. "Buddy's here to protect you. He's not going anywhere." Emily hesitated, then spoke again, a little faster now. "Sometimes she wouldn't bring food, or she'd tell me to clean things that were too heavy. And if I asked to go outside, she said no. She said people would take me away." Her eyes dropped to the floor. I thought maybe she was right. Michael felt a slow burn rise in his chest, not the quick flash of temper, but the deep, steady heat of resolve. He met her gaze and kept his voice steady. "No one is taking you away. Not now, not ever." By the time they left James's office, the case file was already forming, a thick folder with labeled tabs for each piece of evidence. Outside, the clouds had thinned, letting through slivers of sunlight that made the frost on the pavement glitter. They stopped at the diner next door for lunch. The waitress, a stout woman with kind eyes and a name tag reading Gloria, served grilled cheese sandwiches and hot cocoa. Emily's hands wrapped around the mug, letting the steam warm her face. Buddy waited patiently at Michael's feet, occasionally glancing toward the door whenever someone came in. As they ate, Michael thought about the road ahead. Victoria would fight. She had already shown she was willing to use whatever leverage she had. But now, he had something she didn't. Truth, evidence, and a daughter who was slowly beginning to trust him. When they returned to the farmhouse, Buddy trotted ahead, circling the perimeter before settling by the porch. Michael knelt in front of Emily, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We've got work to do before court," he said, "but I promise no one will separate us again." She studied his face for a long moment before giving a small, decisive nod. Okay. And for the first time since he had walked into the dusty old house, Michael felt like they were on the same side, not just as man and child, but as father and daughter. The courthouse loomed ahead, a rectangular mass of gray stone that seemed to drink in the cold winter light. Michael parked the truck near the front steps, his hands gripping the wheel for a moment before shutting off the engine. Emily sat beside him, bundled in a navy wool coat Gloria from the diner had insisted she take last week. Her hair had been brushed smooth that morning, but she still clutched the same worn teddy bear, its edges fraying from years of being held too tightly. Buddy lay in the back seat, ears flicking at every sound outside, his amber eyes fixed protectively on Emily. Inside, the corridors smelled faintly of paper and floor polish. Courtroom 3 was already half full when they entered. The benches were lined with townsfolk, some curious, others clearly there to support Michael. Karen Miller sat in the second row, wearing a heavy gray cardigan and a knitted scarf, her sharp eyes softening when she caught sight of Emily. At the front, James Porter stood by the plaintiff's table, his suit pressed crisp, a stack of neatly organized folders in front of him. His posture was military straight, his gaze calm but alert. He gave Michael a brief nod as they took their seats. On the opposite side, Victoria Blake sat with her attorney, a slim man in his 50s named Vincent Hale. Hale had slicked-back silver hair, a narrow fox-like face, and thin-rimmed glasses that reflected the courtroom lights. His charcoal suit hung on him like it belonged to someone else, but the precision in his movements hinted at a man used to controlling the tempo of a room. Victoria herself was dressed in a tailored black dress and a pearl necklace, her hair swept up into its usual perfect chignon. She offered Michael a faint smile that didn't touch her eyes. The judge, Margaret Ellison, entered promptly at 9. She was a woman in her late 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with short dark hair streaked with silver. Her face was lined, but not unkind, and her hazel eyes carried the weight of decades in the courtroom. She had a reputation for fairness, but also for being unsparing when someone insulted her intelligence. James opened the case by laying out the timeline: Samantha's death, Victoria's assumption of care, Emily's isolation in the old farmhouse. He presented the birth certificate first, pointing to the smudging and pale discoloration as evidence of tampering. The father's name, my client's, was nearly erased, he told the court, holding the document so the judge could see. But the original seal remains intact, and the paper trail from the registrar's office confirms its authenticity. Next, he read excerpts from Samantha's journal. His voice was steady, but the words themselves carried an emotional weight. Samantha's fear, her mistrust of Victoria, her unbroken hope that Michael would return for Emily. Karen Miller was called as the first witness. She stepped to the stand with her scarf still looped around her neck, speaking clearly and without hesitation. Samantha told me herself. If Michael came back, Emily was to go to him. After Samantha died, Victoria came the same day and took control, but she didn't take Emily to her home. She left her in that cold, empty house, sometimes alone for days. Vincent Hale rose to cross-examine, his tone smooth, almost casual. Mrs. Miller, is it possible you misremembered what Samantha said? Emotions run high during grief. Karen fixed him with a steady look. I've buried friends before, Mr. Hale. I remember what people say in their last days, and I remember the look in Samantha's eyes when she spoke of Michael. I'll not forget it. The turning point came when James asked Emily to speak. Michael's instinct was to shield her, but the judge assured them the questions would be brief. Emily stood, her small hands gripping the railing in front of her. Her voice trembled at first. I just want to be with my dad. I don't want to be sent away again. I'm not her daughter, she said, glancing toward Victoria. I'm only my daddy's daughter. A hush fell over the courtroom. Even the court reporter's fingers paused on the keys for a fraction of a second. Several people in the gallery wiped at their eyes. Victoria's expression didn't waver, but her fingers twisted the pearl necklace once. Twice. James closed by submitting the DNA test results, proving Michael's paternity beyond dispute, and Samantha's signed but undelivered letter, naming him as Emily's guardian. Judge Ellison studied each document in silence before leaning back in her chair. Her ruling was clear. Custody of Emily Harris is granted to her biological father, Michael Harris. Furthermore, This court orders an investigation into allegations of document forgery, neglect, and abandonment against Victoria Blake. Michael felt the tension drain from his shoulders. He turned to Emily, who looked up at him with wide, wet eyes, and in that moment, he knew the fight had been worth every step. Buddy wagged his tail once as if sensing the shift, and when Michael knelt to hug his daughter, the dog moved closer, pressing against them both. The snow had melted into patches across the yard, leaving the earth damp and dark beneath the pale spring light. The farmhouse still bore the weathered bones of its years, but now there was life in its walls. Freshly cut boards replaced the rotting porch planks. The windows had been scrubbed until the glass caught the morning sun, and smoke rose steadily from the chimney, carrying the faint scent of pine from the woodpile Michael had stacked himself. Inside, Michael knelt on the kitchen floor, showing Emily how to press soil into a wooden seed tray. She wore an oversized plaid shirt that used to be his, sleeves rolled up past her elbows, and her blonde hair was tied in a loose braid. Her hands moved carefully, each small palm pressing down with more intent than force. "These will be tomatoes," he told her. "If we're patient, they'll be ready by summer." She smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth lifting in a way he had begun to see more often. Buddy wandered in from the porch, his 6-year-old frame still strong, black and brown coat gleaming in the light. He nudged Emily gently with his nose, earning a giggle as she rubbed his ears. "He likes tomatoes?" she asked. Michael chuckled. "Not unless you count chasing squirrels out of the garden." The living room had changed too. Where there had been dust and torn curtains, now there were shelves Michael built himself, filled with books he found at the secondhand store in town. A hand-me-down rug from Karen Miller covered part of the worn wooden floor, and in the corner near the fireplace, Buddy's bed sat with a few toys Emily had picked for him at the feed store. That evening, as the light faded to amber, Michael lit the fire. Emily sat cross-legged on the rug, a library book open in front of her. She stumbled over a few words, pausing to ask, "How do you say this one?" Michael leaned over to guide her, patient and steady. Buddy lay stretched out near the hearth, head resting on his paws, his eyes half-lidded in the glow. In town, people had started to talk, not in the sharp, suspicious way they had when the farm was empty, but with curiosity and approval. Gloria from the diner had stopped by twice with pies. Karen brought seeds from her own garden, and even the hardware store owner had offered Michael a discount on tools. One Saturday morning, Michael took Emily to the cemetery on the edge of Cedar Creek. The ground was soft from rain, and the headstones were dotted with wildflowers just beginning to bloom. They stopped at Samantha's grave, where Michael had placed a simple wooden marker until he could afford the stone she deserved. He crouched down, resting a hand against the damp earth. "I found her," he said quietly, "and I'll protect her for the rest of my life." Emily stood beside him, her small hand curling into his, the wind tugging gently at her braid. The walk back was quiet but warm in its own way. Emily seemed lighter, her steps less tentative, as if the visit had closed a door she'd been afraid to touch. Buddy trotted ahead, pausing now and then to glance back at them, his tail wagging once before continuing on. That night, the three of them settled in front of the fire after dinner. Michael sat in the armchair, Emily curled into the corner of the couch with her bear, and Buddy stretched across the rug like a living hearth. The crackle of the fire was the only sound for a long time. Then Emily spoke, her voice soft but sure. "It's nice here. I don't get scared anymore." Michael met her gaze, and for the first time since he had stepped into the dusty house months ago, he felt the full weight of what they had built. Not just shelter, but a home. The kind worth fighting for. Outside, the wind swept across the fields, carrying with it the promise of another season. Inside, in the house that had once been a place of abandonment, there was warmth, light, and the quiet certainty that whatever storms might come, they would face them together. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with lightning in the sky or a voice from the clouds. They come quietly, like a knock on the door, a loyal dog's bark, or a child's small voice saying, "I'm home." For Michael and Emily, what happened was more than a legal victory. It was the kind of blessing only God can weave from pain, patience, and love. In our everyday lives, we may not all face battles in court or storms from the past, but we each have moments when we must stand up, protect what's precious, and choose love over fear. If you've ever been touched by an unexpected kindness or felt rescued in a moment of despair, you've seen God's hand at work. Let this story remind you that no matter how abandoned or broken something seems, a family, a home, even a life, God can restore it in ways we could never imagine. If this story moved you, please share it so others can feel its hope. Leave a comment with your thoughts or your own miracle stories. And subscribe so you never miss another tale like this. May God bless you and keep you, and may He guide your steps to the blessings He has prepared for you.